This video is sponsored by ExpressVPN. Pet Sematary is probably one of Stephen King's most cynical books. After all, given the nihilistic tone of the story and the somewhat sinister nature of its themes, he initially chose not to publish it. But to fulfill his contract with Doubleday Publishing, he hesitantly let it see the light of day and now considers it one of his deepest reservations as an author. Which is interesting considering, within the decade prior to Pet Sematary, King had wrote Carrie, The Long Walk and Cujo, which I'd argue are just as, if not partially more bleak than Pet Sematary. But regardless, the book exemplifies a negative energy in King that he tends to either imply or even suppress to a certain extent in many of his other novels. And that's because it highlights specific morbid fears that are personal to him. So, let's talk about Pet Sematary. While it's definitely far from his most aggressive, profound, or even scariest novel, Pet Sematary explores the common fear of her own mortality. The story follows the Creed family as they move to Maine because Stephen King said so, and following the death of their daughter's cat, the father Lewis befriends his neighbour Judd, who takes him to Pet Sematary, a graveyard created by children to bury their deceased pets, where just behind a closed-off section is an ancient Indian burial ground said to summon buried corpses back from the dead.
Fuck off, animal.
While a creepy-ass cat is one thing, when Lewis's 2-year-old son Gage is abruptly mowed down by a truck in the latter half of the story, Lewis decides to bury him at Pet Sematary in order to resurrect him, only for Gage to return not as himself, but something possessed by uncharacteristically violent and hostile behaviour. For even more disturbing context, Judd eventually explains to Lewis that centuries ago, the Indian tribe that once lived there were believed to have been terrorized by a Wendigo, a folkloric creature that symbolizes greed and excess consumption that led to the tribe turning to cannibalism as a result of the curse that the Wendigo placed on them. Thus, this explains why the ground behind Pet Sematary is described as sour, because by effectively feeding the Wendigo the deceased, it would possess them into terrorizing others. And while the 1989 film adaptation pretty much ignores the presence of the Wendigo, in the book it lingers throughout as this mysterious unseen creature off in the distance that's essentially pulling all the strings that lead to the circumstances that the main characters find themselves in. Pet Sematary plays on this poignant supernatural fear that dead is better, in that attempting to intervene with life's unpredictable and mostly unpreventable tragedies will inevitably result in more harm than good, because we simply shouldn't try to play God. Which, in the case of the book, is conveyed through the Wendigo as this divine evil god who has control over everything, and even manipulates others into thinking they have some sense of control when that's such an ultimately feeble idea. The great idea behind Cujo, one of Stephen King's previous books, was that it played off our sensitivity towards animals and this inherent human arrogance that we dominate the food chain, when really there is nothing to stop a domesticated pet from returning to its animalistic roots and biting you on the bollocks when you least expect it. Rabies be damned. While I consider Stephen King far from being a morbid writer, considering he at least tries to give us some form of light at the end of the tunnel, he has a pretty eerie way of approaching human vulnerability by forcing characters into a situation that tests this ignorant sense of invincibility, particularly when it comes to children. However, in Pet Sematary, while there is still a persistent fear for the safety of children, most of the narrative's naivety and, well, general ignorance is presented through the adult characters. My favourite visual motif of the story is how the parents and their neighbour Judd acknowledge how literally close to danger and death they are via the busy road used frequently by speeding truckers, and of course the cemetery not far from their house. Time and time again, the foreshadowing is made abundantly clear when the parents constantly remind their kids to stay away from the road, which would eventually lead to Gage's demise. Yet from a pure historical context, road accidents are quite an unfortunate and unexpected occurrence in everyday life. That conventional sense of tragedy, you could say, is then reinforced by the mother Rachel, explaining how she was left severely traumatized as a child by the death of her sister Zelda from spinal meningitis, which is a very painful and horrifically unpleasant way to go. The point being, it establishes two distinct forms of death so common to our daily lives, one being sudden and accidental, and the other being a prolonged, emotionally challenging battle with natural illness. What it brings to the story is this recurring fear of death that lingers subconsciously in the back of many of our minds. The parents ultimately feel like they're constantly battling to protect and shelter their children as they're starting to become introduced to death despite the reluctance of the mother for obvious reasons. Lewis, on the other hand, has become relatively numb to death after seeing dozens of his patients dead on his table as a doctor, until his son's passing, which he feels greatly responsible for, and only intensified by his estranged relationship with Rachel's parents who blame him as well, sparking a desperation to actually save a life despite his initial cold, hopeless demeanour that there is nothing he can do to prevent death. This is an idea established early in the story when Lewis is unable to save student Victor Pascal from a sudden vehicle accident, and when Victor's spirit begins appearing before him, Lewis thinks he's being negatively haunted for not saving Victor's life, when it's actually the opposite. Victor explains to Lewis that he simply did the best he could because, after all, Lewis is not God with the powers of resurrection or healing or something like that. Instead, Victor wants to return the favour by warning Lewis that he can't let his inability to save every life become his obsession. Specifically, Victor begs Lewis not to go beyond the barrier between life and death, because death is just inescapable regardless of what you believe. Lewis has devoted his life to saving others, but struggles with the reality that it is impossible to save everyone. And so the power that the cemetery has given him is something that humans fundamentally aren't equipped to wield, because, as the Wendigo suggests, we have no control over life's mysterious and spontaneous ways. In the book, Judd's wife has a heart attack which Lewis tries to assist with, prompting Judd to return the opposite favour of helping Lewis to resurrect his daughter's now-dead cat, acting as a sort of contradiction to Victor's ghost's warning, because of course Lewis would naturally put his faith in another living human than some gruesomely killed spirit. In the film, however, the Creeds have a housekeeper who is given a more significant role in the story by hanging herself as a result of a stomachache that we can assume was cancer that she refuses to have Lewis look at. It represents a different sense of powerlessness that escalates Lewis's lack of acceptance towards death, a feeling not uncommon in the grieving process. It's actually a plot point in Judd's story about a guy called Timmy, whose father resurrected him following his death coming home from the Second World War. When Timmy comes back as a violent zombie, his father becomes a madman who refuses to take death as permanent, which is an overwhelming thought within itself, leading to dire consequences as a result of the cemetery's evil nature. While there is a sense of guilt in Lewis and Rachel's individual experiences, what's recurring in both stories is the responsibility carried with death. Rachel was merely a child who felt blamed by her family for her sister's passing, while Lewis suffers from guilt towards an accident that wasn't his fault, again with negative response from Rachel's family. More so, their daughter Ellie's symbolic relationship with her pet cat represents the responsibility children must eventually face. As Lewis morbidly puts it, the death of a pet makes it easier to cope with the loss of a person, so the cat by default carries a stench of death long before it actually begins to, well, smell like a corpse. By the end, Lewis's attempt to save lives results in the loss of others, including Judd and Rachel, the latter of whom is taken by Lewis in a final desperate bid to resurrect her by embracing the signs of the Wendigo's control unbeknownst to him and ignoring the signs given to him by Victor and Judd, leading to his own inevitable demise. Or just the ambiguity that the book's ending leaves us with, which, to be fair, I thought was a lot bleaker than knowing that he dies. Pet Sematary, just by its incorrect spelling, already insinuates this unearthly presence where death is technically a good thing in comparison to the evil that lies beneath. While we talk so much about stories about taking life for granted, here's one that essentially talks about taking death for granted. There are spiritual undertones to Pet Sematary in terms of the perception of an afterlife or what really happens to us in death. But in a horrific sense, the story lingers on the idea that once we die, our bodies are simply left as vessels for something else to take control, whether it be good or, more likely in this case, evil. There is no happiness found in revival, just a perpetuation of the same pain and suffering brought on by death in the first place. It encapsulates the core symbolism of what a cemetery represents. As the story puts it, it's a place where the dead speak, a place not made for the living, and not to be ironically disturbed by them. It leaves a feeling of uncertainty towards what would return if we bring back those who passed. And so, as Judd and Victor perpetuate throughout, no matter how much you grieve for another chance to be with those you love, sometimes dead is better. Hi everyone, thank you so much for watching. Given the nature of the kind of content I make, if you find yourself as weary and anxious about real-world horrors like me, then that's why this video is sponsored by ExpressVPN. As someone who greatly values their privacy, using ExpressVPN allows me to prevent blood-sucking parasites like hackers or random snoopers from tracking me online and collecting and or stealing my personal data, especially when using credit cards for online shopping or paying for subscriptions. Basically, ExpressVPN encrypts your IP address, whether you're using a phone or a computer or a tablet or even a games console, so you can safely and securely navigate the treacherous terrain of the online world while remaining completely anonymous. But on a less dire note, as a film buff like many of you, I mainly use it to access content not available in my country, or to bypass the horrible selection on Netflix here in the UK. By simply downloading ExpressVPN, whether it be the app itself or by using the Google Chrome extension, I then just select a random location in the US, click on the little connect button, and now I feel like my Netflix subscription is actually worth a damn. ExpressVPN is less than $7 a month with a 30-day money-back guarantee if it turns out it's not really your thing. So take back your internet privacy today and find out how you can get 3 months free by clicking the link in the description box, ExpressVPN.com/Ryan. That's EXPRESSVPN.com/Ryan for 3 months free with a 1-year package. As a dyslexic, I'm impressed I got that in one take. Virtual high five, because there's no one else in this room to high five. So please take your privacy back today with ExpressVPN, and as always, stay very, very safe, and I'll see you all very soon. Bye.